It's 2044, and I'm quite surprised still to be alive. 20 years ago, when I addressed the Tweeddale Society with predictions of doom, I was already in my late 50s, and the previous year had already breached the UN's dangerous warming threshold of 1.5 degrees. Although partly due to El Niño, 2024 temperatures were rapidly tracking further into uncharted territory, and climate scientists were frightened and appalled. It was a lethal year. By the end of April, the Asian heatwave had killed millions. Weeks later, the unprecedented cyclones in Bangladesh brought even greater calamity. Later, when the scale of the global maize and wheat harvest failures became clear, prices and scarcity soared, and as ever, the poorest suffered the most. Some of us had had enough. It was clear that politicians in the market were not riding to the rescue. In fact, their everyday cynicism and privilege had become almost blatant. Those of us who could quit our jobs and hobbies and began focusing full-time on facing the threats head-on. Others joined us while still juggling work and family life. Many more wished us well, while just barely coping with the everyday challenges of their lives. Someone suggested we call ourselves TEARS, Tweeddale Emergency Adaptation and Resilience Summit. It was a bit of a mouthful, but somehow it stuck. We committed to a permanent summit meeting, local action, somehow to try to lessen the harms of what looked very much like a spiraling global catastrophe. Throughout the summer, our marquee stood on Tweed Green. We had begun in the Borough Hall, but quickly outgrew it, especially once creche and breakout facilities were needed. There was almost an odd sense of festival, even though some felt we were fighting for the very survival of life on Earth. The first time we met, the fury in the room was frightening. So soon after the horror and conflict in Gaza, the lamentable international aid response in Bangladesh was impossible for many to accept. When the talking stick came into her hands, Aisha flushed and stood up. How can you sit here, wringing your hands and worrying about the price of wheat, before driving your SUVs back to your oil-powered villas and foreign holiday brochures? Your generation has fucked our future and left millions of my kin to die in lands devastated by decades of your greed. I can hardly bear to be in the room with you and your selfish little lives. She turned away, sobbing with rage and grief, shrugging off the comfort of her friends. Silence. The sound of breathing. Tara, who chaired many of our sessions with such skill, met her eyes steadily and said, Aisha, perhaps nothing will ever put right the wrongs you are feeling, and I'm so sorry to witness your pain. But please stay with us. Please bring your rage and your insight and help us. There's an awakening happening here, and God knows each one of us is facing hard truths that may never heal. But we're here to do what we can in solidarity. Those early sharings were raw. The farmers were there, despairing in the face of ruinous weather and sky-high costs. Ewan spoke for many. You invite me again to your vegan buffet with corn balls, and I'll ram a Sainsbury's Taste the Difference New Zealand leg of lamb up your... We got through it. We were seeing more hope in each other than the system that had broken us. By autumn, we'd formed an alliance based on local food resilience. Although we didn't have food riots as in Egypt and Sudan, we couldn't buy flour for love nor money, and our food banks were overwhelmed. Both Trump and Modi had banned wheat exports, and stock market speculators were cashing in. We weren't scripting an episode of The Good Life here. This was a serious, citizen-led emergency reset of plans and expectations. Some issues: grain, would we ever afford it again? Would British crops fail too as weather patterns deteriorated? Fruit and veg, our dependence on imports. Why? Especially with such a history of soft fruit orchards and even vineyards. Sheep, we grew more of them than we ate. Farmers, priced off the land, undercut by imports, battered by freak weather and input costs, defensive on climate and nature, and generally hurting. So we asked, for our own security and to reduce our impact if the global system fails, how can we change the ways in which we feed ourselves? I'll have to skim, as time is short, but we tried a lot of things. I suppose they broke down into voluntary, commercial, and governmental. At voluntary scale, we found that a few lairds and farmers were prepared to call the bluff of the homegrown brigade and make allotment land available. A garden buddies scheme brought lots of neglected back gardens into production too. And the food bank had already teamed up with a local farm the previous year. So in the years following the 2024 grain shock, DIY horticulture boomed, both in and around the border towns. When an Upper Tweed farm came on the market in 25, locals were prepared. A Scottish Land Fund grant enabled the purchase, and the South of Scotland Enterprise seed funded a community-supported agriculture scheme. The 5-year transformation plan saw diversification into fruit and veg, coppice woodlots and hemp, with flock size reduced, and new wet woodland on the floodplain, soon supporting beaver ecotourism. On the commercial side, the grants and incentives landscape was changing rapidly, particularly as self-reliance now topped the Hollywood agenda. The Council and NHS Board jointly secured funding that allowed them to sign long-term price-guaranteed contracts with local producers. Meanwhile, a new agri-renewable subsidy supported growers seeking to insulate themselves from energy price shocks by developing solar, wind, hydro and heat pump schemes. Together, these kick-started a rapid expansion of fruit and veg production, which built throughout the 20s. Further diversification was supported by an enhanced orchard establishment payment and a pilot scheme investigating the viability of walnut and hazel production. The Rural College ran some urgent small-scale local trials with alternative grains such as quinoa, buckwheat, millet and spelt. And they were particularly keen on de-risking grain production and also to experiment with no-till methods that might lessen erosion and improve soil health. As well as the support for local production, Holyrood broke with a UK policy of leaving food reserves to the market. They began creating a Scottish strategic food reserve, aiming at first to build a 3-month grain stockpile of 250,000 tonnes. Peeblesshire successfully bid for the first mega silo to be sited in a local disused quarry. I don't know, there was some optimism by the late 20s. There had been such a big push on food sovereignty and a real shift from supermarkets to local markets. It seemed there were reasons to be cheerful, apart from a disturbing fashion trend in garish tartan. So that was food. Unless you include the protein brewers, hoping to displace soya in animal feeds, or the Clydesdale crazies, although they don't seem so crazy now. But while we're on land, let's touch on textiles. This was the decade of wool and weed. Walkerburn was rebooted with a new mill, manufacturing building insulation from undervalued local sheep's wool. There were even efforts made to get the old hydro pump storage scheme back up and running. And finally, the red tape was torn down on hemp production, allowing local growers to supply the insulation manufacturers in Jedburgh. But although locally manufactured insulation excited some, in practice it was too scarce and expensive for what needed to happen next. We had tens of thousands of shockingly cold homes, and the Earth, as our service provider, had just delivered our final notice. The bill for ballsing up the climate had come due. Insulate Tweeddale Community Interest Company was initially staffed mostly by retired volunteers. Cutting back on golf or angling to lug around rolls of fiberglass looked like a bum deal to me, but credit to everyone, they went for it. Perhaps the fact that the founder was ex-military helped. He embodied an invaluable combination of failure is not an option and JFDI. JFDI? That's just effing do it. The proposition was simple. A decade of paltry insulation grants, followed by a Scottish scheme absolutely mired in bureaucracy, had made absolutely net zero dent in the energy inefficiency of our housing stock. Insulate Tweeddale CIC with JFDI. Pick an estate, speak to all the residents, bring on a couple of static caravans and some storage and blitz through it. Families moved out one or two at a time, walls were battened, clad and replastered, roofs and floors blanketed, and the crew kept on moving down the street. The office handled permissions and grants, and economies of scale plus non-profit status kept householder costs down. Credit to the government, they carved out some budget once they saw how the speed and efficiency were outclassing what had gone before. Soon, the reliance on volunteers lessened, and some of the much-promised green jobs actually came into being. Over 5 years, Insulate Tweeddale spread throughout the borders and transformed 20% of the region's homes. I have to admit, Solar Kick was a direct rip-off of their ideas, but I'm still proud of it. Basically, I thought, every house has a roof, and solar is way less disruptive than that insulation gig. I followed in Insulate Tweeddale's wake, asking the same streets if they'd let me sort out solar for them. I didn't think we had much time left. Global politics was so unstable, and trade routes so disrupted, whether by Houthi attacks or the drought-induced closure of the Panama Canal, that I wasn't sure we'd been importing Chinese panels for much longer. Call me selfish, but I wanted those panels to be on my neighbours' roofs as the shit increasingly hit the fan. There's a saying in the prepping community that you're only as safe as your neighbour, and I wanted to know the lights would stay on. So I was proud of our financial model. Our any good roof, nothing up front contract allowed us to handle the grants and loans, and the only obligation on the householder was to pass on their electricity savings to us until the balance was cleared. We thought it might take an average of 10 years, and in fact, enhanced grants and the soaring energy prices of the 30s more than halved that. You know, 70% of the solar you see around here is from Solar Kick. I'm proud of that. So, I say I'm proud, but don't misunderstand me. Solar and other renewables may have grown in proportion to the total energy mix, but the world has just kept on growing the total. Annual fossil fuel use has increased literally every year since 2024. That's why the Arctic summers are ice-free. That's why melting permafrost is spewing methane and propelling us towards 2.5 degrees. That's why millions of migrants are weeping at Europe's door, and that's why I weep daily at the tragic, irreparable damage sustained by the non-human world. But hey, we all have panels on our roofs. Aren't you glad your freezers are still running? But while we're talking about temperature control, actually almost everything seems to be about temperature control, I want to share what happened with Aisha, because she was an absolute inspiration. Aisha essentially put us, within a week of our first meeting, Aisha put tears on notice. She couldn't support us. In fact, she'd actively oppose us if we were to be exclusively a parochial, first world, self-serving, resilient communities forum. There was a historical debt to pay, and even if we were all destined to go down the pan, she would force us to right some of our wrongs in the process. And so she became our reparative action global emissary. For short, RAGE. And she absolutely knocked it out of the park. Along with passion, Aisha had the quality of single-pointedness that so often is key to getting things done. She picked one thing, one place to do it, and one source of funds. The fact that 3 years later she was managing almost half of Hollywood's aid budget is kind of another story. The one thing Asia picked was urban heat. And, the place was Sierra Leone, and her source of funds was us. Yes, she guilt-tripped us into big donations, but rightly so. Her chosen partner was a non-profit called MIR, Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalancing, a spin-out from Harvard, focused on cooling the Earth by reflecting sunlight. Wealthier Tweeddale residents poured funds into their pilot project in Freetown, Sierra Leone. I'm going to run this video for 5 minutes.
In 2023, it's obvious to most people who ever just look outside that there's a real climate impact around us.